Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
All right, it's been a while since we've caught up on the news, so let's have a look at some fun stuff this week. For the first story, we're off to Egypt, where we're going to find some evidence for one of history's great mysteries. And that would be the arrival of the mysterious sea people, who supposedly just rolled up one day and arrived in the eastern Mediterranean, destroying all of the great civilizations there, in a process that became known as the Bronze Age collapse. Well, it's a little bit older than Kevin Costner. Specifically, this all went down at 1200 BC, or about 3,000 years ago, when simultaneously the great cities of the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians, and the people of the Levant fell apart all at once. Now, there's lots of other explanations for what might have caused all this, including disease epidemics, climate change, volcanic eruptions and related weather events and seismic activity, migrations, etc. But multiple sources make cryptic mentions of these mysterious sea people. However, as to who these feared invaders were, what they wanted, where they came from, and where they eventually went, nobody's too clear about all of that.
I saw it. Some angry member of the kitchen staff. Did you not tip them? Oh, the terrorists, they ran that way. It was a run by fruiting.
And unhelpfully, these various sources use multiple names, like the Sheridan, the Luca, and the Libyans. Well, not the modern-day Libyans. This was a term used to describe a confederation of tribes, I believe, coming from the West. But in any event, some archaeologists working in the northwestern Nile Delta region recently uncovered a fort complex, an extensive one, that suggests that the Egyptians were busy guarding their coasts from invaders at this very time. Now, I don't know exactly where this is for one of two reasons. First, I can't read the Arabic that the government's press release was in. And secondly, they often don't want to reveal the exact location as not to encourage looting activity. But the ruins were full of finds which dated the place from 1500 BC to 1070 BC, so the site was probably in use for about 400 years. Now, it really was a maze-like structure. It had kitchens with ovens, barracks, storerooms, defensive architecture, the works. So given all the activity at the site and its long time of use, archaeologists found tons of mundane stuff there, like pottery, cooking implements, foodstuffs like grains and fish and assorted cow parts, and even toilet implements like a makeup applicator for kohl, that ancient Egyptian eyeliner. Apparently back then they had as inclusive a military as today. However, some of the more notable finds included these hieroglyphic inscriptions, which mention the great pharaoh Ramses II, as well as another high official called Bey. There were lots of seal stones like those we've discussed at Mycenae, including typical Egyptian motifs like their deities and lotus flowers and stuff like that. There was some jewelry, like this necklace made of faience, which is a kind of an early form of glass which I believe originated in Egypt. But probably the coolest thing was this elaborate bronze sword which bore the cartouche, just another name for the official signature or seal, of Pharaoh Ramses II himself. And what's more, it was found in a small room right off of one of the entrances to the fort, which suggests that even though it was clearly a high-status fancy weapon, it actually probably was intended for use in defending the entranceway, rather than just serving as a ceremonial weapon for show.
Oh my God! I'm fighting with cardboard!
Now, there's a couple things worth noting here. First, back in the day, forts, even sometimes relatively remote ones, were not kind of sealed, secure military zones only like they are today. You could find there lots of merchants, tradespeople, craftspeople, the soldiers' families, all sorts of hangers-on that were there too, making these forts sort of a small community. Think back to Vindolanda, that Roman fort way up in Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain that we visited a few times already. There, archaeologists found all sorts of things, from personal correspondence to curse tablets, clothing, foodstuffs, the remnants of a shoemaker's workshop, and yeah, that wooden dildo, maybe. So that's probably what we're seeing here in Egypt. Not only the remnants of the soldiers' lives, but all the other people who like to hang around them.
Daisy boots are gonna walk
Hey,
all
baby!
over you.
You got girlfriend, Vietnam?
And though the Sea People headline certainly makes the story kind of sexy, remember, this fort lasted, or activity at the fort lasted, until 1070 BC, more than 100 years after the Bronze Age collapse. So that date doesn't match up very well. Moreover, the press certainly didn't mention any signs of destruction or burning, which is a bit curious. So that either means the Sea People didn't come this way, or perhaps their destruction was not as wide as reported and as devastating. Or who knows, maybe the Egyptians abandoned the place and some other folks took up residence there. We don't know. So, though the placement of this fort really does speak to the fact that the Egyptians saw some kind of need to take a defensive posture at this time, it's not really specific evidence for the Sea People. So that's just another reminder on how to read the archaeology news critically, because some writers do like to make it a little sensational just to generate clicks.
A bullshit artist.
All right, for our next story, we're going to stay in the same general region, but go back to a much earlier time, the Paleolithic, where we're going to re-examine the early relationship between humans and Neanderthals, something we've discussed a couple times already. Specifically, we're going to look at early human graves in Israel, as well as Neanderthal graves there, plus also in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Uzbekistan. Because it seems this is where and when the practice of ceremoniously burying the dead began. Note, I'm avoiding the R word. So we're going back over 120,000 years ago, at a time when Homo sapiens, that would be us humans, were still kicking it in Africa, and the Neanderthals were hanging in their hometown of Western Europe. But then favorable climatic conditions, specifically more water, made the previously unpassable Sahara and Arabian deserts more hospitable, and this encouraged the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals to get moving. So with the Neanderthals coming in from the northwest and the Homo sapiens coming from the south, from Africa, they met in what is today Israel. And as we know from the other episode, they did eventually start interbreeding, but now was not the time, not just yet. Now, prior to those dangerous liaisons, the two populations lived mostly separately. And I hate to reinforce old caveman tropes, but they actually seem to congregate around specific caves. However, it doesn't always seem that these early hominins, the early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, actually lived in these caves. Often it appears that they just sort of used them for ceremonial and symbolic, I'm avoiding the R word, practices like painting or burials.
Even in most primitive man, the need to create was part of his nature.
And it's this latter part, burials, that we're going to be talking about right now, because it seems like this is the first time and place that both humans and Neanderthals actually started burying their dead. Of course, there were early human burials in Africa, there's a few very early ones of young children, and there were Neanderthal burials in Europe. But those actually came later than these in Israel, which again seem to have happened about 120,000 years ago. And hence a team of researchers got together and examined these two species burial rituals to sort of compare and contrast what they did. Now, before you get all excited, don't expect their funerals to be anywhere near as elaborate as ours are today.
Man did not have the time for complicated rituals. Funeral services were often brief.
And examining 17 separate sites, the team came up with some pretty interesting findings. First, although both humans and the Neanderthals used caves for burials, the Neanderthals seemed to prefer the inside of the caves, whereas the humans seemed to bury their dead sort of out on front in the porch. Both buried men and women of all ages, though the Neanderthals were more likely to bury infants. They also interred grave goods with the dead, and mostly animal products like bones, antlers, shells, and the like, although the specific selection varied somewhat between the humans and the Neanderthals. The body positions were largely similar, although the Neanderthals had a little bit more variety in how they positioned the dead. But one big difference is symbolic. The Neanderthals often seemed to put a shaped rock like limestone underneath the heads of the deceased as a kind of pillow, sort of to give them comfort in their repose.
10,000 years will give you such a crick in the neck.
Humans, on the other hand, interred seashells like this conch shell, as well as ochre, which is a kind of a clay used for pigments that are sort of earth tone, and sometimes they colored the shells with the ochre. Now, they buried these in and around the graves, and if you think about it, way back in the day, if you're not living on the shore, these would be rare and valuable goods, these seashells. Now, the really interesting question is how this idea of burying the dead and in relatively similar ways come about among these two populations simultaneously. The authors posit that this was due to competition. The humans and the Neanderthals were suddenly thrown into this space together, and they were competing for food and resources. So these graves were sort of a way to mark their territory, like, this is my cave. Now, studying early medieval England, this is in fact familiar to me, as at different points in that period, it was posited that graves which were sort of prominent with mounds and high places were also placed to demarcate the territory of a tribe or a small chiefdom. However, I don't know why we have to be so pessimistic. Maybe this was just an instance of these two populations learning from each other. Now, I'm not sure whose bright idea this would have been first, but after all, there are just benefits to burying the dead. For example, not having smelly corpses rotting around where you are or carrying them far away and wasting that energy. And if you remember, the Neanderthals were at least occasionally cannibalistic. So perhaps the humans were just showing them a better way to sort of dispose of the dead.
Now I'll stop you with bread. It don't hurt, because you're dead. And you're certainly lucky you are.
So, though the competition explanation certainly does make sense, I'm not sure why knowledge sharing and cultural exchange aren't on the menu too, right alongside the cannibalism. This can be a feel-good story too. After all, we know that these two populations would later come to occasionally mate. So just because they're living separately at this point doesn't necessarily mean they didn't get along. Perhaps they just had different beauty standards. Alright, so that's our archaeology news for today, coming to you from the Near East. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.